Zorath Vel had catalogued 287 species across 3,600 years of service to the Galactic Accord. He had sat across negotiation tables from creatures that breathed methane, from beings whose entire language was built from ultraviolet light, from ancient things that had watched their own suns go cold and simply moved on to the next one. He had visited worlds so breathtaking they made his second heart ache, and worlds so hollow they felt like the universe had given up halfway through building them. In 3,600 years, he had never once been caught off guard. He expected Erath to be no different. The application file arrived 11 days before the delegation was scheduled to depart. He poured himself a cup of cold Sava tea. The warming coil on his kettle had burned out 3 centuries ago, and replacing it had never once risen to the level of something worth doing. He sat at his desk and opened the file. It was thin. He had once read a more detailed report about a single dormant volcano on an uninhabited asteroid. The Galactic Accord required every species applying for observer status to complete a formal documentation packet. 62 mandatory categories, each one designed to build a picture of a civilization, its philosophy, its history, its position in the cosmos. Every species he had ever processed had filled those categories the way rivers fill canyons, slowly, deliberately, until the shape of them became clear. The Arathi had answered all 62, technically, but their answers were compressed, blunt. Some were so short he found himself checking whether the formatting had failed. Sentences where paragraphs were required, paragraphs where entire chapters should have lived. Either they did not understand that longer answers made better impressions, or they simply did not care about making impressions at all. He turned to Category 9, Primary Philosophy of Cosmic Existence. This was where most species revealed themselves. The Venhali had submitted 38 pages of carefully structured argument. The Droon, who carried a warrior tradition 12,000 years deep and had spent 8 centuries overcoming it, had submitted 90 pages and seemed proud of every word. He had read all of them. He had always read all of them. The Arathi answer was 5 words. Still figuring that one out. He read it once, then again, then a third time, as if one of the 4 of them, the sentence, the page, himself, or the universe, might have changed position in the interval. None of them had. He moved on. Category 38, History of Interspecies Conflict. A simple category. Most species, by the time they had developed faster-than-light travel, had long since resolved whatever relationships existed with neighboring intelligent life. Some had nothing to report at all. The standard answer was a list of treaties and a brief account of how they'd been reached. The Arathi answer was 3 words, none yet, waiting. He paused on the phrasing, not none, not applicable, none yet, as if they had looked at the category, noted the current absence of data, and fully expected the column to fill in later, as if conflict with other species was something they were simply queuing for, patiently, the way you queue for something you know is coming. He tagged it, Cultural Linguistics, Possible Translation Artifact. Then, after a moment's thought, he added low priority. He should have tagged it differently. He would understand that later. The journey to Erath took 7 days. He finished the file in 5 hours and spent the remaining time rereading old notes on species he had already catalogued, the way some beings listen to music for comfort. He did not go back to the Erathi file. He should have. Erath was green in a way that felt almost confrontational. He had visited green worlds before, but this planet's green was saturated past the point of suggestion. It was insistence. Vegetation covered the hills like a fever that had no intention of breaking, dense and relentless, impossible to look at for long without feeling that the planet itself had opinions about being alive. The city they landed in was called Stavport. It had been chosen, he was told, because of its centuries-long history as a place where Erathi factions had come to make agreements with one another. He noted, without particular emphasis, that this implied they had needed to make such agreements many times. He filed that under standard anthropological observation. He did not give it a secondary tag. The diplomatic chamber was his first real surprise, though he would not call it that. He would describe it in his official notes as an architectural detail worth minor documentation. The room was far larger than any delegation of human-scale beings required. The ceiling soared to 3 times the necessary height. The walls were pale carved stone. Windows ran high along every wall, positioned so that light entered from all directions equally. There were 6 doors, 1 in each wall and 2 more flanking the far end, all evenly spaced. A young Erathi staff member noticed him looking. "Old building," she said helpfully. "Pre-Accord era, 15th century local calendar." He nodded politely. In his personal journal, not his official report, he wrote, "Clear sight lines from every seated position to every entrance. Elevated windows prevent exterior approach without being observed. 6 exits ensure no seat in the room is more than 9 meters from an escape route. This is not a diplomatic chamber. This is a room designed by people who have been trapped in rooms before." He looked at what he had written. He almost crossed it out. He did not cross it out. He simply turned the page. The Erathi delegation arrived at the precise scheduled moment, not early, not late, exactly on time. He had processed 287 admissions. He had seen eager species arrive early, and confident species arrive fashionably late, and nervous species arrive in clusters with too many people. He had never once seen a delegation arrive at the exact agreed second. The precision suggested they had thought carefully about what their timing would communicate. Their lead diplomat was a woman named Davin Osei. She was not young, but not old either, somewhere in that particular Erathi middle distance where both states seemed to bleed together into something that simply looked like endurance. She wore a plain dark coat with no rank markings, no decorative insignia, nothing to indicate her position except the way the room organized itself quietly around her. She shook her hand. Most species did not shake hands. It was a known Erathi custom, and the delegation had been briefed. He had practiced. He extended his hand, and she took it, and the grip was firm, noticeably firm for a being of her size. She held his gaze for exactly 4 seconds after the handshake ended. Then she smiled, welcomed him warmly, and the moment passed without wrinkle. In his personal journal later, he wrote, "The handshake, the eye contact, I read it as a dominance signal, standard for species transitioning out of competitive hierarchical structures." And then, much later, he would add a second line beneath it, "I was not wrong about what it was, I was wrong about what it meant." The formal proceedings went smoothly. They always did. He had run 287 of them, and they moved like water finding a container's shape. Speeches, recognitions, recitations delivered in the standard register, received by the Arathi with the particular expression of beings who were listening carefully while having already made their minds about something. Eroth was admitted to the Accord as an observer species, not a member, observer. The distinction was considerable. An observer could attend sessions, could speak, could watch. An observer held no vote, no treaty protection, no claim on Accord military resources. It was, in the language of the Accord's foundational charter, acknowledged presence, which was exactly as limited as it sounded. The Arathi delegation received this with professional grace. He had the distinct sense that they had not applied for observer status because they wanted protection. He had the sense they had applied because they wanted to understand how the room worked before they decided what to do inside it. He did not write that instinct down. He did not trust it enough. After the session, the Arathi hosts had arranged a reception, food, drink, the particular kind of casual conversation that was not casual at all, but was simply formality wearing different clothes. He moved through it in the practiced way he had moved through 287 similar events. And then he stopped. One wall of the reception hall held a display, long, horizontal, running the full width of the room. He had assumed it was decorative, but he found himself standing close enough to read it, and what he read made him stand very still. It was a timeline, Arathi history, arranged from the earliest evidence of organized civilization, roughly 14,000 years ago by their calendar, to the present. It had been put up by the Arathi themselves, clearly arranged to show progress, technological development, the arc of a species becoming more. He read it left to right. He could not find a gap between conflicts, not a real one. From the very beginning of recorded Arathi history to somewhere in the last century, there was no era in which they had existed as a species entirely at peace with themselves. One war ended and another began. In certain periods they overlapped. In some centuries, 3 and 4 and 5 ran simultaneously in different parts of the same world. He stood in front of that wall for what he later calculated was 14 seconds. The Arathi had put this up. They had chosen this from everything they might have displayed for a visiting delegation they were trying to impress, a wall of their wars in the welcome hall, with no evident shame and no evident pride. The staff moving through the room showed no awareness that this was unusual, no embarrassment, no posturing. Simply, here is our history. These things happened. You should know. He thought about what tag to assign it. He settled, finally, on cultural dissonance, low priority. He picked up a glass of something cool and amber from a passing tray. He moved to a window. He stood and drank and looked out at the green city, and he did not write anything else that evening. His official report on Arath was completed on the return journey. It was thorough. It was always thorough. He noted the biosphere, the geopolitical structure, the technology levels. He noted that the Arathi had achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 180 years prior. He noted their unified global government was only 33 years old, which was very young. He noted the handshake and described it as a dominant social greeting consistent with competitive hierarchies. He noted the diplomatic chamber as architecturally traditional for its period. He did not note the 14 seconds. His conclusion read, observer species, classification, developing, Technological trajectory accelerated, but not unprecedented. Unified governance too recent to assess long-term stability. Dominant behavioral profile, goal-oriented, highly competitive, strong internal bonding. Threat assessment, not required. Recommend standard monitoring. No expedited review necessary. He sealed the file. He sent it to the archive. He poured himself a cold cup of Sava tea and sat in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought about the timeline. He thought about not yet, waiting. He opened his eyes. He picked up the file. He held it without reopening it, the way you hold something when you cannot decide whether to put it back in a drawer or keep it somewhere you can reach it quickly. After a long moment, he put it back in the drawer. He moved on to his 288th species, a gentle people from a quiet world who had never once had a war and cultivated luminescent seagrass for cultural ceremonies, and they were easy to categorize, and he was grateful. He did not think about Erath again for a long time. When he did, it would not be his choice.
What the body was built for. Ressa had always believed that violence was a phase, not an original belief. It was the foundational principle of Venhali's civic education, printed above the entrance to every public institution on her homeworld. Violence is what a civilization does before it learns to stop. Every advanced species eventually laid it down, the way you lay down a tool that no longer serves. The Vanhali had laid it down 1100 years ago. They considered themselves average in this regard, perhaps even a little behind the curve. She packed for 4 weeks. She stayed for 9 months. The skeletal files arrived first in a small rented office in a university district of a city called Karath, with bitter local coffee she had developed an embarrassing dependency on, and birdsong outside the window she had not once stopped to identify. She read the files carefully, and when she finished, she sat without moving for a considerable time. Then she read them again. The Arathi skeleton was dense. She had known this from the survey data. What the data had not conveyed was the specificity of that density. It was concentrated in the long bones, in the joints, in the hands and forearms. The marrow cavities were oversized, larger than those of any comparable species at an equivalent evolutionary stage. The output capacity was, in the clinical language of the study she was reading, extraordinary. She looked up the evolutionary reason. The reason was endurance. The enlarged marrow existed to sustain the body past its normal fuel reserves, to keep oxygen-carrying cells cycling through the muscles after the point where other species' bodies would have imposed a mandatory stop. It was a biological emergency tank built into the skeleton itself, for when the first tank ran dry and the organism needed to keep going anyway. She wrote in her notes, "Evolutionary pressure favoring sustained physical output past exhaustion threshold requires further context." She opened the next file. Muscle fiber composition. She was familiar with the basic principle: fast twitch fibers for explosive power, slow twitch for sustained effort. Most species had a dominant type that reflected their ecological history. Predators that chased in short bursts, fast twitch. Migratory species that covered long distances at steady pace, slow twitch. The balance was a biological signature. It told you what an organism had been built to do. The Arathi had both. Not a lean toward one, not a moderate balance, a genuine, fully developed abundance of both types, distributed throughout the body in a pattern described in the study she was reading as statistically without documented parallel among Accord survey species. She stared at this sentence for a long time. What she was looking at was a body built to sprint and built to run long distances, in the same body, simultaneously functional for both. A body that could explode into motion and then sustain that motion, that had reserves engineered into the skeleton for when the reserves in the muscles gave out. She wrote, "What ecological pressure produces this?" She underlined it twice. She ordered more coffee. The pain tolerance studies were where she first felt something she did not have a clean word for. She read them carefully. She read them twice. She found independent studies and read those too, expecting variance, looking for outliers. There were no outliers. The baseline pain threshold for most Accord species, the point at which the body's distress signal overrides voluntary function, was remarkably consistent across very different biologies. The principle was universal. When the pain signal exceeds a certain magnitude, the body protects itself by making the organism incapable of continuing. It was not weakness, it was architecture. The body understood that continuing past that point meant destruction. The Arathi body understood the same thing. The threshold was simply set at a level that, by comparison, seemed almost incomprehensible. She read documented cases of Arathi completing physical objectives after sustaining injuries that would have rendered most Accord species unconscious. They were not unaware of the injury. The pain was real, significant, and fully registered. They simply continued. One study examined behavior following bone fractures in the field. A statistically significant portion of Arathi with fractured extremities had completed their current task before stopping to seek medical care. Not because they hadn't noticed, not because the fracture was minor, but because they had assessed their objective, assessed their condition, and made a choice. She looked out the window at the trees for a long moment. Every species has a wall, she thought, a line the body draws, a point where it says, "Here, no further. I am protecting you from yourself." She looked back at the file. The Arathi had the wall. They had simply decided it was a recommendation. In her 4th month, a human colleague, Dr. Amara Solis, a marine ecologist who had taken her institutional liaison role with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely enjoyed the company of aliens, asked how the research was going. Ressa told her, carefully, what she had been finding. Solis listened without interrupting. Then she nodded, unsurprised, and said, "Have you read anything about persistence hunting?" Ressa had not. Solis explained it to her simply, the way someone explains a thing they learned in childhood and have never had cause to question. The theory, early Arathi were not the fastest animals on their planet, not close. They could not outrun the large prey they hunted. What they could do, what nothing else on their world could do, was keep going. They would pursue prey for hours, sometimes half a day, across open ground, in the full heat of their sun, at a pace that was not fast, but absolutely did not stop. The prey, built for short explosive speed, would eventually overheat. Its body would force it to stop. The Arathi would still be walking toward it. Ressa sat with this. "So you hunted," she said carefully, "by refusing to stop." "Pretty much," Solis said.
She was eating lunch. She seemed entirely unbothered by what she had just described. And this was how long ago? Solus thought about it. A couple million years, give or take. Ressa wrote nothing down because she did not yet know where to put it. The neurology files arrived in her 6th month, and she read them in a single sitting that lasted 13 hours. The stress response. Every known species had one. The mechanism varied, but the core was consistent. Mortal danger triggered a physiological state that temporarily elevated certain capabilities, narrowed focus, and prepared the body for emergency action. An ancient mechanism, a survival mechanism, shared in some form across most known life. What was not shared was what happened inside that state when the organism in question was Erathi. She read study after study, combat medical reports, field accounts, interviews with Erathi ascribing in their own words their experience of life-threatening situations. She read about the chemical cascade that flooded their systems under extreme stress. She read about the narrowing of time perception. Erathi in mortal danger frequently described time slowing, processing accelerating, the world becoming very clear and very simple. That part was documented in other species at lower intensity. What was not documented anywhere else was the word that kept appearing in the Erathi accounts. Clarity.
Not fear, not panic, not the incoherent desperation of an animal in danger. Erathi in extreme mortal danger, repeatedly across study after study, independent teams, multiple decades, described a state of heightened clarity, of everything becoming simple, of knowing with complete certainty exactly what needed to happen next. Some described it as among the most focused states they had ever experienced. Some described it, and she could see in the transcripts the particular discomfort of people being honest about something they knew sounded strange, as almost pleasurable. She forwarded 3 excerpts to colleagues with no commentary, just the raw text. All 3 wrote back, "Surely this is a measurement error." She replied with a bibliography of 14 studies. None of them responded to that email. She read the wars in her 7th month. She had been avoiding them. She knew they were there. The timeline from the Stavport Welcome Hall had been sitting in the back of her mind since she first saw a photograph of it in Zorath Vell's formal report, to which she had been granted research access. He had described it in a footnote as decorative display. She had looked at the photograph and thought, that is not decoration. She read every major Erathi conflict from the dawn of their recorded history to the present. She approached it scientifically. She charted causation, frequency, geographic spread. She tracked technology, from hand-carved weapons to directed energy arms, in what was, geologically speaking, almost no time at all. She tracked casualties. She tracked resolution patterns, which conflict ended in negotiation, which in exhaustion, which in the annihilation of one side. She did not read it to judge. She read it to answer one question: how does a species that does this to itself survive? The answer, when she found it, was quiet and terrible, and she sat with it for a long time before she wrote it down. The species survived because the ones who were less suited to surviving the violence did not survive it. For tens of thousands of years, the Irathi who felt more pain and stopped sooner and were less capable of functioning through mortal stress, they died. And the ones who didn't die had children, and those children inherited in their bones and their neurology and their chemistry a slightly stronger version of what had kept their parents alive. Generation after generation. No intention behind it, no design, simply the grinding, patient work of a world that kept selecting for the ones who could endure. The Accord's peace was 9,000 years old. No Accord species had lived under that kind of selection pressure for 9,000 years. The Irathi had lived under it until, in geological terms, last week. She flew home and did not submit her report for 7 weeks. She sat in her apartment and looked at the mountains through her window, clean, ancient peaks above a world that had found peace so long ago that violence was almost academic. And she thought about everything she had found: the bones, the muscle fibers, the pain threshold, the stress response, the wars, and the retired soldier she had interviewed in her 8th month, an old man named Gavrik, who had kind eyes and offered her tea in his garden, and when she asked what combat had felt like, had looked at his cup for a long time and said quietly, like being completely awake.
He had paused. I know how that sounds. I'm not saying it was good. I know what it cost. I know, she had said. But you asked, he said. They had sat in the garden after that, without speaking. Birds moved in the trees. The light shifted slowly. He refilled her cup without being asked. When she finally opened her report and began writing, she wrote for 4 days. When she reached the conclusion, she stopped, read it, and moved it to an appendix. Appendix D. The last one. The thing that, if anyone read it at all, they would reach last. It read, "The Irathi have not evolved past violence. They evolved through it. The distinction is not semantic. A species that has shed violence as unnecessary has never been tested the way the Irathi have been tested. A species that has survived violence as selection pressure carries the results of that selection in its bones, its neurology, its pain chemistry, and its capacity for decision-making under mortal stress. The Accord's current model of civilizational advancement, in which violence is a developmental stage to be outgrown, does not adequately account for a species that did not outgrow it, but was shaped by it into something that existing frameworks cannot comfortably contain. Reclassification recommended. Priority urgent. She sealed the file. She sent it to the archive. For 5 months, no one mentioned Appendix D. She had expected this. She had written Appendix D for the moment when someone eventually did.